The stars hung like diamonds against the velvet expanse of space, their light flickering faintly as if whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. On a desolate moon orbiting a dying star, an ancient battlefield stretched endlessly before her eyes, a wasteland littered with the remnants of war machines and forgotten dreams. She stood atop a jagged ridge, her towering form silhouetted by the dim glow of distant suns. The alien queen was not what one might expect from tales spun by frightened storytellers or feverish imaginations. Her presence commanded awe rather than fear, though it was impossible to deny the primal shiver that ran down spines at the sight of her. Her body shimmered with iridescent scales that caught even the faintest glimmers of light, shifting colors like liquid rainbows cascading over her massive frame. Each scale seemed alive, pulsating softly in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. Her elongated limbs ended in delicate claws tipped with obsidian-black talons, sharp enough to rend steel yet precise enough to cradle the smallest of creatures without harm. Her face, her face, was both haunting and beautiful, a mosaic of contradictions. Eyes wide and luminous, they burned with intelligence so profound it felt almost invasive to meet her gaze. They were pools of swirling galaxies, endless depths where time itself seemed to unravel. Her mouth curved into something between a smile and a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth designed for destruction but softened now by an expression no one could have anticipated: longing. She wore armor forged from materials unknown to human science, its surface etched with intricate patterns that told stories older than civilizations. Every line, every curve spoke of battles fought and victories earned, of sacrifices made and lives saved. It gleamed despite the dust and grime of countless campaigns, untouched by decay or wear. Around her neck hung a pendant shaped like a crescent moon, glowing faintly with an inner fire that pulsed in sync with her breathing. It was said among her kind that this amulet held the essence of her people's history, a relic passed down through generations of queens. Yet tonight, she clutched it tightly, as if drawing strength from its warmth. Behind her loomed the ruins of a once great city, its skeletal remains clawing at the heavens like desperate hands pleading for salvation. Towers lay toppled, their foundations cracked and crumbling under the weight of centuries. Streets twisted and broken led nowhere, swallowed whole by creeping vegetation that refused to let go of the past. And yet, amidst the devastation, there was beauty, an eerie stillness that spoke of resilience, of life finding ways to endure even when all hope seemed lost. This place had been home to many before the wars came, a sanctuary for beings of all kinds until greed and hatred turned it into a graveyard. But tonight, the air carried a different energy. A tension crackled through the atmosphere, electric and raw, as if the very fabric of reality braced itself for something monumental. The queen's antennae twitched slightly, sensing vibrations on frequencies imperceptible to lesser beings. She tilted her head ever so slightly, listening, not just with her ears but with every fiber of her being. Something was coming. Someone was near. Her chest rose and fell steadily, each breath deliberate, measured. Despite her size and power, there was grace in her movements, a fluidity that belied her immense strength. She shifted her weight forward, leaning slightly as if preparing to leap into action. But instead of aggression, her posture radiated anticipation. There was a softness around her edges, a vulnerability hidden beneath layers of muscle and bone. For all her majesty, she looked fragile. Not physically, of course. Nothing short of divine intervention could harm her. No, it was deeper than that, a fragility of spirit, of purpose. And then she saw him. At first, he appeared as little more than a shadow moving across the horizon, indistinct and fleeting. But as he drew closer, his figure resolved into clarity. He was tall for a human, broad-shouldered and lean, his body honed by years of combat and survival. His armor bore the scars of countless skirmishes, dents and scratches marring its once pristine surface. Strands of dark hair escaped the confines of his helmet, framing a face weathered by hardship yet undeniably handsome. His eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the landscape with practiced vigilance, searching for threats, or perhaps answers. He moved cautiously, each step deliberate, boots crunching softly against the brittle ground. In one hand, he gripped a weapon unlike any she had seen before, a fusion of human ingenuity and alien technology, its barrel humming faintly with latent energy. Yet despite his readiness for battle, there was something else about him. Something indefinable. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, not arrogantly, but with quiet confidence. Or maybe it was the faint tremor in his fingers, betraying nerves he tried desperately to conceal. Whatever it was, it called to her. For a moment, neither moved. Time seemed to stretch infinitely, suspended in the space between predator and prey, ruler and subject, alien and human. Then, slowly, deliberately, she descended from her perch. Her footsteps echoed softly against the barren terrain, each impact sending ripples through the loose soil beneath her feet. She stopped mere paces away, towering over him like a storm cloud blotting out the sky. He did not flinch, though his grip tightened fractionally on his weapon. His jaw clenched, muscles taut as he prepared for whatever came next. But what came next was not violence. Instead, she reached out, one massive hand extending toward him, palm open and vulnerable. Her voice, when it came, was low and resonant, carrying tones that vibrated deep within his chest. "I finally found you, human," she said, her words laced with an emotion so potent it took his breath away. Confusion flickered across his features, quickly masked by suspicion. Who was she? What did she want? And why did her voice sound like recognition? Before he could respond, she closed the remaining distance between them. With astonishing gentleness, she wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close in an embrace that defied logic and reason. Her warmth enveloped him, seeping through his armor and into his very soul. For a fleeting instant, he forgot how to breathe, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of the moment. This was no enemy. This was something else entirely. Something he couldn't begin to comprehend. Yet as her words lingered in the air, as her presence pressed against him, a single thought bloomed in his mind. She knows me. The embrace lingered longer than either expected, defying the boundaries of instinct and logic. Her arms, impossibly strong yet achingly gentle, cradled him as though he were both a treasure and a memory long lost. He stood frozen, unsure whether to resist or surrender, his weapon hanging loosely in his grip. The metallic scent of her scales mingled with the faint aroma of ozone, creating an otherworldly perfume that filled his senses. His heart pounded erratically, torn between fight and flight, but something deeper rooted him to the spot. It wasn't fear, it couldn't be. Fear didn't feel like this. Fear didn't make your chest ache with a strange, hollow yearning. "I've searched for you," she murmured, her voice reverberating through his bones like a song played on strings too taut. "Across stars and voids, through lifetimes and echoes. I've waited." Her words carried a weight that transcended language, each syllable dripping with meaning far beyond comprehension. He wanted to pull away, to demand answers, to raise his weapon and remind her of the chasm between them. But her grip wasn't restrictive, it was protective, almost tender. And her tone, gods, her tone was unbearable in its sincerity. "Waited," he managed to choke out, his voice hoarse and unsteady. "For what?" "For me." The absurdity of the question struck him even as he asked it. Why would a being such as her seek him out? He was nothing. A soldier, a wanderer, a man who had survived more battles than he cared to count. To her, he should have been insignificant, disposable. Yet here she was, holding him as if he were the axis upon which galaxies turned. Her response was slow, measured, as though she were choosing her words carefully. "Not just you," she said, her luminous eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "You are part of something greater, something ancient. You carry it within you, though you may not know it." His brow furrowed, confusion warring with disbelief. "What are you talking about? What do I carry?" She hesitated, her antennae twitching again as if sensing something beyond his understanding. Then, with a sigh that seemed to ripple through the very air around them, she released him, but only partially. One massive hand remained resting lightly on his shoulder, anchoring him in place. "It is not my place to explain everything," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But I can tell you this, your arrival here is no accident. Neither is mine. We are bound by threads woven before either of us drew breath." The words sent a chill racing down his spine. Bound? By what? By whom? His mind raced, sifting through fragments of memory, searching for anything that might make sense of her cryptic declaration. He thought of the mission that had brought him to this forsaken moon, the desperate plea for help from a colony stranded in hostile territory. He thought of the battles he'd fought, the comrades he'd lost, the promises he'd broken. None of it explained why an alien queen would speak to him as though he were the answer to some cosmic riddle. "You're speaking in riddles," he said finally, his voice sharper now, edged with frustration. "If you know something, tell me. Stop hiding behind vague nonsense." Her expression softened, though her eyes remained piercing. "Would you believe me if I told you the truth? Would you accept it, even if it shattered everything you thought you knew?" He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. The truth was, he didn't know. How could he? Everything about this encounter defied explanation. She wasn't attacking him, wasn't demanding anything. Instead, she spoke as though they shared a connection older than time itself. And while his rational mind screamed that it was impossible, another part of him, the part buried beneath layers of cynicism and survival instincts, whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was right. Before he could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. Dust spiraled into the air, and the faint hum of engines grew louder, cutting through the silence like a blade. Both of them turned toward the source, their bodies tensing in unison. Over the horizon, a fleet of ships emerged, sleek and predatory, their hulls painted in hues of crimson and black. They bore markings unfamiliar to him, but the Queen's reaction told him everything he needed to know. Her grip on his shoulder tightened, her claws digging slightly into his armor. "They've found us," she said, her voice grim but resolute. "This changes nothing. You must come with me." "Come with you?" he echoed, incredulous. "Why would I do that? I don't even know who you are." Her gaze hardened, though there was no malice in it, only determination. "Because if you stay, they will kill you. And if they kill you," she trailed off, her jaw tightening, "then everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed, will have been for nothing." The ships drew closer, their shadows stretching across the barren landscape like grasping fingers. Lights blinked along their undersides, scanning the terrain with mechanical precision. He could hear the whine of weapons charging, the ominous promise of destruction hanging heavy in the air. Panic bubbled up inside him, but he forced it down, focusing instead on the creature before him. "Who are they?" he demanded, his voice rising above the growing din. "What do they want?" "They are hunters," she replied, her tone clipped. "And they want what I protect. What we protect." "We?" he repeated, shaking his head. "There is no we. You keep saying these things, but you haven't given me a single straight answer." For a moment, she looked as though she might argue further. But then, with a suddenness that startled him, she leaned down until her face was level with his. Her breath washed over him, warm and tinged with the faintest hint of sweetness. "Trust me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of approaching engines. "Please." It was the plea that broke him. Not the desperation in her tone, nor the vulnerability in her gaze, but the simple, raw honesty of it. Against all odds, against every instinct screaming at him to run, to fight, to survive, he found himself nodding. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you owe me answers." A flicker of relief crossed her features, quickly replaced by urgency. "Follow me," she commanded, turning toward the ruins behind them. Without waiting for a response, she began moving, her strides eating up the distance with terrifying efficiency. He followed, his legs pumping furiously to keep pace, his mind reeling with questions he feared he might never answer. As they reached the edge of the ruined city, she paused, her head tilting upward as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, with a motion so fluid it seemed choreographed, she extended one massive arm and swept aside a section of collapsed wall, revealing a hidden passageway beneath. The entrance yawned open like a mouth ready to swallow them whole, its darkness absolute and impenetrable. She gestured for him to enter, her expression unreadable. He hesitated, staring into the abyss. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of explosions erupted, shaking the ground violently. The hunters were closing in. He glanced back at her, meeting her gaze one final time. "If this is a trap," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them, "I'll find a way to stop you." To his surprise, she smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If it were a trap," she replied, "you wouldn't stand a chance." And with that, She ushered him inside, sealing the entrance behind them as the world outside erupted into chaos. The passageway swallowed them whole, plunging them into a suffocating darkness that seemed alive, pressing against their skin like a living entity. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't see, couldn't hear anything beyond the pounding of his own heart. But then, with a soft hum, bioluminescent veins embedded in the walls began to glow, casting an eerie green light that illuminated their path. The queen moved ahead confidently, her massive frame navigating the narrow tunnel with surprising agility. He followed closely, his boots scraping against the uneven floor as he struggled to keep up. The air grew colder the deeper they ventured, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that stung his nostrils. Strange symbols carved into the walls glowed faintly, pulsating in sync with the rhythm of his breathing. They seemed to watch him, their shapes shifting subtly whenever he glanced directly at them. He tried to focus on the queen's silhouette ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the questions gnawing at him. Who were the hunters? What did she mean by protect? And most importantly, why did she seem to think he was integral to whatever grand design she hinted at? Where are we going? He asked finally, breaking the oppressive silence. His voice echoed strangely, bouncing off the walls and returning distorted, as if the tunnel itself sought to mock him. To safety, she replied without looking back. Her tone was clipped, distracted. And to answers. Answers you've been avoiding giving me, he shot back, irritation bubbling to the surface. You drag me into this mess, talk in riddles, and expect me to trust you blindly? That's not how this works. She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Her eyes burned brighter in the dim light, twin galaxies swirling with emotions he couldn't decipher. Do you want the truth, human? She demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Or do you want comfort? Because the two rarely align. He faltered, taken aback by the ferocity in her gaze. I want the truth, he said after a pause, his voice quieter now. Even if it hurts. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, she gestured for him to continue following her. Very well, she said. But know this, once spoken, words cannot be unsaid. Once seen, truths cannot be unseen. They resumed their trek, the tunnel widening gradually until they emerged into a cavernous chamber that stole his breath away. The ceiling arched high above them, supported by crystalline columns that refracted the dim light into dazzling rainbows. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which rested an object unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was a sphere, roughly the size of a human head, composed of shifting, translucent layers that seemed to contain entire worlds within. Nebulas swirled lazily inside, stars blinked in and out of existence, and continents drifted across miniature oceans. It pulsed gently, emitting a soft hum that resonated in his chest. What is that? He whispered, unable to tear his gaze away. That, she said, stepping closer to the pedestal, is the seed of eternity. A fragment of creation itself, imbued with the potential to shape reality. And it has chosen you. Chosen me, he echoed, incredulous. How does something like that choose anyone? She turned to him, her expression grave. It doesn't choose based on merit or worthiness. It chooses based on resonance. Your soul vibrates in harmony with its essence, though you may not understand why. That is why the hunters pursue you. They seek to claim its power for themselves. He stared at her, his mind struggling to process the enormity of her words. So what happens now? Am I supposed to guard it? Use it? Destroy it? Her lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. That depends on you. But beware, wielding such power comes at a cost. One I suspect you are not yet prepared to pay. Before he could respond, the ground trembled violently, nearly knocking him off his feet. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the glowing veins in the walls flickered erratically. The hunters had breached the outer defenses. Their time was running out. We need to move, she said urgently, gripping his arm and pulling him toward a secondary exit. As they fled, the sphere's hum grew louder, almost deafening, as if protesting their departure. He glanced back once, catching a glimpse of its radiant core before the passage sealed shut behind them. Outside, the battle raged. Explosions lit up the night sky, casting the ruins in stark relief. Shadows danced wildly as figures clashed in brutal combat, her warriors, he realized, fighting to hold back the tide. She barked orders in a language he didn't understand, her voice carrying authority that inspired immediate obedience. Soldiers rallied around her, forming a protective perimeter as they prepared to make their last stand. He watched, awestruck, as she transformed before his eyes. Gone was the hesitant, almost vulnerable creature who had embraced him earlier. In her place stood a warrior queen, fierce and unyielding, her every movement exuding lethal precision. She turned to him, her expression hardening. "Stay close," she commanded. "And remember, the seed chose you for a reason. Trust yourself." With that, she charged into the fray, her claws flashing like silver lightning as she tore through the enemy ranks. He hesitated, torn between admiration and terror. Then, gripping his weapon tightly, he followed her into the chaos, knowing full well that nothing would ever be the same again. In the midst of the cacophony, amidst the clash of steel and the roar of plasma fire, he found himself inexplicably drawn to her side. She moved like a tempest, a force of nature unleashed, her every strike calculated yet wild with raw emotion. Her warriors fought valiantly, their loyalty evident in the ferocity of their defense, but it was clear they were outnumbered. The hunters pressed forward relentlessly, their crimson-armored forms advancing with mechanical precision, their weapons cutting down allies with ruthless efficiency. He ducked behind a crumbling pillar, his pulse hammering in his ears as he reloaded his weapon. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal, making it difficult to breathe. Yet through the chaos, he could still feel her presence, a beacon of strength and resolve that anchored him. He risked a glance in her direction, watching as she leapt into the air, her massive form silhouetted against the fiery backdrop. With a single swipe of her claws, she cleaved through 3 hunters, their bodies collapsing in heaps of sparking circuits and shattered armor. But for every foe she felled, 2 more took their place. The tide was turning, and he knew it. Desperation clawed at his throat as he fired another volley, the shots finding their marks but doing little to stem the onslaught. "We can't hold them," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. "There's too many." Her response was immediate, sharp, and laden with determination. "Then we adapt," she roared, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. She landed beside him, her chest heaving, her scales smeared with ash and blood, not hers, but theirs. "Follow me." Without waiting for acknowledgement, she surged forward, her movements fluid and unpredictable. He scrambled after her, weaving through the battlefield with a mix of adrenaline-fueled recklessness and sheer instinct. Together, they carved a path through the enemy lines, her brute strength complementing his precision. For every blow she delivered, he countered with a burst of energy from his hybrid weapon, the fusion of human ingenuity and alien tech proving devastatingly effective. Yet even as they pushed deeper into the fray, doubt gnawed at him. What was the point of this resistance? They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped on a dying moon with nowhere left to run. Was this truly the end? Would all their efforts amount to nothing more than a footnote in some forgotten history? As if sensing his turmoil, she turned to him mid-stride, her luminous eyes locking onto his with an intensity that silenced his inner monologue. "Do not falter now," she growled, her voice low and commanding. "You carry the resonance of the seed within you. Let it guide you." "The seed?" he snapped, incredulous. "It's back there. How am I supposed to?" His words were cut short as a hunter lunged at him, its blade slicing through the air with deadly intent. Instinctively, he raised his weapon, firing a shot that struck true, but the creature kept coming unfazed. Panic surged within him as he stumbled backward, searching frantically for an escape route. Then, out of nowhere, she was there, intercepting the hunter with a ferocious swipe of her claws. The creature staggered, giving him just enough time to regroup. "Focus," she barked, her voice snapping him back to reality. "Feel it. Trust it." And somehow, inexplicably, he did. Closing his eyes for the briefest of moments, he reached inward, seeking the strange resonance she had spoken of. At first, there was only noise, the clamor of battle, the rush of his own heartbeat, the chaotic swirl of fear and uncertainty. But then, beneath it all, he felt it. A faint vibration, like the thrum of a distant string plucked in the vast emptiness of space. It resonated within him, subtle yet undeniable, syncing with the rhythm of his breath and the cadence of his thoughts. When he opened his eyes again, the world seemed different, sharper, clearer. The hunter's movements, once a blur of aggression, slowed to a discernible pattern. Their attacks, though still formidable, revealed gaps and weaknesses he hadn't noticed before. And most startling of all, he could feel the weapon in his hands responding to him, its hum growing louder, its energy crackling with newfound intensity. "Now," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Strike." He obeyed without hesitation, channeling the resonance into his actions. His first shot hit with unparalleled accuracy, disabling a hunter's weapon system. The second pierced its core, sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. Emboldened, he pressed forward, his movements becoming a seamless dance of offense and defense. Each step, each swing of his weapon, felt guided by something greater than himself, as if the seed's essence flowed through him, amplifying his abilities. Around them, the tide began to shift. Her warriors rallied, emboldened by the sudden change in momentum. Together, they formed a phalanx, driving the hunters back with renewed vigor. The crimson tide faltered, their advance halted by the unexpected ferocity of the counterattack. Victory, once a distant dream, now seemed tantalizingly within reach. But then, a deafening roar split the air, drowning out the sounds of battle. All heads turned toward the source, a colossal figure emerging from the smoke and flames. It towered over the battlefield, its hulking frame encased in obsidian armor that gleamed menacingly under the flickering light. Its eyes burned with malevolent intelligence, and in its massive hands, it wielded a weapon unlike anything he'd ever seen, a staff crackling with dark energy, its tip wreathed in tendrils of shadowy mist. "No," the queen breathed, her voice tinged with dread. "It cannot be." "What is that thing?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. "That," she replied, her tone heavy with resignation, "is their leader. The harbinger." The harbinger raised its staff, and the ground quaked beneath its feet. With a single gesture, it unleashed a wave of energy that sent soldiers flying in all directions, their cries of pain echoing through the night. The queen shielded him instinctively, her body absorbing the brunt of the blast. When the dust settled, she staggered slightly, her scales scorched and cracked, but her resolve unwavering. "This ends now," she declared, her voice ringing with defiance. Turning to him, she added, "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, do not engage it directly." Before he could protest, she charged at the harbinger, her speed and agility unmatched. Their clash was cataclysmic, a maelstrom of fury and power that shook the very foundations of the ruins. Sparks flew as her claws met the harbinger's staff, each strike reverberating like thunder. He watched, transfixed, as she fought with everything she had, her movements fueled by desperation and love, for her people, for her cause, and perhaps for him. But the harbinger was relentless, its blows landing with crushing force. She was strong, but even she had limits. As the battle raged on, he could see the toll it was taking on her. Blood trickled from wounds he hadn't noticed before, and her movements grew slower, more labored. And then, it happened. With a brutal sweep of its staff, the harbinger knocked her to the ground, pinning her beneath its immense weight. She struggled, her claws scrabbling uselessly against the unyielding armor. Its crimson eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, he saw fear in her expression. "Enough," the harbinger intoned, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the depths of hell itself. "Your resistance is futile. Surrender the seed, or perish." She spat at it, her defiance undiminished even in defeat. "Never." The harbinger raised its staff, preparing to deliver the killing blow. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was watch as death loomed over her. Until something inside him snapped. The resonance surged, flooding his veins with an overwhelming surge of energy. His vision blurred, then sharpened, the world around him bathed in hues of gold and violet. Without conscious thought, he raised his weapon, aiming not at the harbinger but at the ground beneath it. The shot fired, and the earth erupted in a cascade of light and debris, throwing the harbinger off balance. Seizing the opportunity, she rolled free, her injuries forgotten in the heat of the moment. Together, they stood side by side, their gazes locked onto the towering adversary before them. For the first time, he felt it, a connection, a unity of purpose that transcended species, language, and logic. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And so, as the harbinger steadied itself, preparing for another assault, he tightened his grip on his weapon and whispered, "Let's finish this." The harbinger charged, its staff crackling with dark energy, but the human warrior and the alien queen moved as one. Channeling the seed's resonance, he unleashed a blinding pulse of light, destabilizing the harbinger's weapon. With a fierce cry, the queen lunged forward, driving her claws into its core. The creature staggered, its armor cracking as it let out a final ear-splitting roar before collapsing in a heap of shadows. Breathing heavily, they stood amidst the ruins, the battlefield eerily silent. Her wounds glowed faintly as she healed, her gaze softening as she turned to him. "You've proven yourself," she said, pride mingling with relief. He nodded, still grappling with what had transpired. Together, they approached the fallen harbinger, knowing this was not an end, but a beginning. Somewhere beyond the stars, greater challenges awaited them.